It sucks having to give up a food due to dietary restrictions. And I would know because out of the big food allergies, I have one of them, which is a allergy to shellfish. Now, allergies are very serious and are best discussed by healthcare professionals outside of YouTube and social media. But in intolerance, well, that's perfect for a guy like me. Yes, I have an intolerance to dairy, and that's the subject of this video. But it wasn't until I made it to college where I learned that actually my relationship to dairy is changing, and thus my war on dairy began. So I cut out all of my favorite foods and started to just come to grips that, hey, maybe I just won't eat dairy ever again. Which again, that sucks. Over the years, I learned that an intolerance is not the same as an allergy. You can actually have some dairy items if you are dairy intolerant, namely things like Swiss cheese or cheddar cheese. But this always frustrated me. Like, why isn't it all or nothing? Why can I make the statement, lactose intolerant, but butter is fine? Pass me the butter naan, but I can't have the mango lassi. These things bothered me. So in this video, we aim to tackle what exactly is lactose intolerance, or really specifically what an intolerance is, and figure out just how intolerant we are to lactose. So if that interests you, be sure to stick around. We're talking about lactose intolerance today. So lactose is a sugar, and as a chemist, I always assumed that lactose, being a sugar, was very soluble in water. It turns out it's actually not that soluble in water, at least in comparison to sucrose, which is very soluble in water. The only difference between the two is that sucrose has a fructose molecule, while lactose has a galactose molecule. And it seems that this simple swap or simple substitution of these sugars really affects its solubility. But one thing that holds true, since they both are sugars, is that they are not soluble in fat. The other thing to define is cheese. So cheese is a fermentation product. At some point, bacteria was introduced to dairy, and that bacteria converted lactose into lactic acid. You can taste lactic acid. It is the tanginess of cheese or yogurt. So if a product is fermented, you should expect it to be low in lactose. I think I'm safe enough in saying that. Further, if you're an adult, you need bacteria to break down lactose. If you don't have bacteria, well, you can't break down lactose. Which is kind of an interesting thought, because maybe if you took a round of antibiotics, maybe then you could cure your lactose intolerance. That'd be an interesting experiment to figure out. So let's talk math real quick. Now, Google says that milk has a water concentration of 88%, and I'm going to assume that butter has a water concentration of 15%. I think that those are safe enough assumptions. I don't think we need to get any more nitty gritty than that. But if you are a dairy scientist and you have better numbers, please, by all means, share them. I also need to relate lactose's solubility to water. And the best way I can think of doing that is coming up with a solubility factor. So earlier I flashed the solubility of lactose on screen. And so I'm just going to take those two numbers, 20 grams of lactose over 100 grams of water, and come up with my solubility factor of 0.2. So we're going to need that later when we start calculating our numbers. Another assumption is that all my dairy products will be coming from this guy, Moo, the zebra that's pretending to be a cow that produces the maximum amount of lactose in all of its dairy products. Obviously, real life will not act like Moo. Like the dairy cows in real life likely, may not act like Moo because Moo is actually producing milk at room temperature. This likely will play a factor with the numbers we see later. Lastly, we need a credible source for all of our lactose concentrations. So this chart from the University of Virginia, which maybe some grad students slapped together, should work well enough. Okay, so try and keep this information with you as we go through this video. If you do get lost, obviously you can just rewind back to this part. Me and Moo will be waiting here to explain it to you all over again. But I don't anticipate that because this is not super complicated. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move into the candidates. Okay, so let's look at our candidates here. Which of these would be a good candidate for calibrating our bodies, so to speak, to just how sensitive we are to lactose? Well, all the fermented products like the cheeses are very low in lactose, which is what we expect. Remember, If it's fermented, all that lactose got converted to lactic acid. This chart backs up that claim. In reality, we really don't want to use a low lactose product to calibrate ourselves with. In other words, we really don't want to like consume, a ton of cheese. And I'm not too sure how sensitive we are to lactose. So I'm glad to see that the chart does back up my original claim, which is if it's fermented, it's low in lactose. Let's move on. Now, what about my favorite dairy product? Butter. So butter, I know it says here that it's 0 grams of lactose, but they're only measuring a teaspoon of butter, which is like 5 grams of butter. It's not a whole lot, but let's do the math real quick. Now I could probably eat like 2 tablespoons of butter in one sitting max, no HBO. I can't imagine eating like a half a stick of butter, which is 4 tablespoons. So moo butter, according to my calculations, would be about less than a quarter gram of lactose. So yeah, I would need to eat like 2 sticks of moo butter before I started having any symptoms, I'm assuming, which is a lot of butter and not really practical for use as a calibrant. So we need to move on. But actually, before I move on, this also explains why I can actually eat butter naan at the Indian spot, but I can't eat mango lassi because mango lassi is made with yogurt. Butter naan obviously has butter in it. So that kind of explains things because it's low in lactose. What about sour cream, right? Well, sour cream is sour, right? It has a high lactic acid concentration. So it makes sense that it actually is low in lactose according to our chart. So can't use sour cream either. Okay, what about yogurt? What about Greek yogurt? Greek yogurt, actually, that one is pretty interesting. It is relatively high in lactose. Like to me, like looking at this chart, 4 grams of lactose definitely seems enough to make cheese. But I'll need to actually test that out for myself because this is just my opinion. We do want to do the math for a good portion of yogurt. Now, for me, I actually have weighed it out once. I like to eat 150 grams of yogurt whenever I do eat yogurt. Obviously, it's lactose free, like a plant-based yogurt. The ironic thing is that like these brands know that, and actually those individual cups of yogurt are 150 grams. So I guess I'm pretty basic in that regard. Now, I'm assuming that 1 ounce of anything is equal to 30 grams of that thing. So, round numbers make math easier typically. So in 6 ounces of yogurt, which is 180 grams, they're getting 4 grams of lactose. Using their math, I get about 3 grams of lactose. Because I think 3 grams is like enough to have symptoms, I'll probably eat half that amount to start off my test. And also, yogurt isn't that rich of an ingredient. I feel like you can probably overindulge in yogurt and not like feel terrible about it. Eating, a pound of yogurt versus like 2 sticks of butter, I feel like people would choose the yogurt over butter in that situation. But, who knows? The internet's kind of weird sometimes. And a pound of yogurt is a lot of yogurt. But yeah, anyways, with that being said, I feel like yogurt is a pretty good candidate for use as a calibrant. But we can't leave out milk. Is milk a good candidate for figuring out how sensitive you are to lactose? Well, let's do moo milk first, just to see how much more potent moo is than regular dairy cows. So with my assumptions, I'm getting roughly 40 grams of lactose. And as you can see, the authors of this table report a value much lower than this, which is a discrepancy. So what that means is there's some learning to do. And since I'm not a dairy scientist, I can only kind of give my best guess of what's going on here. But if I am veering into Austin pseudoscience food, please correct me. If you're a dairy scientist, I would love to have a conversation with you about this. So yeah, let's get into my guess. Again, I'm no dairy scientist, but I do understand that solubility changes based on temperature. And lactose is no different in this regard. Lactose's solubility decreases as temperature decreases. So the colder it is, the less soluble lactose becomes. Now, the dairy industry is highly regulated. I think throughout the entire process of milk production, the milk is kept cold. So even if the amount of lactose is high coming out of the cow, I think it drops as the milk is being processed. Since moo makes milk at room temperature, then his milk by default should have more lactose. Now, the question of is milk a good calibrant to calibrate our bodies with, it's up to you. You can pick whatever one you want. You have the concentrations, like you have the means to calculate the lactose concentration. or lactose amount. It doesn't really matter which one you pick. I'm going to go with yogurt. Which brings us to the actual test. So in order to calibrate yourself, you have to accurately weigh out how much dairy product you're consuming, calculate the amount of lactose in that dairy product, and then you need to eat it, right? You need to actually eat it and figure out at what point do you start having symptoms? At what amount of lactose do you start having symptoms? You know, there are many dishes you could try. My favorite one growing up, my personal favorite one growing up was a bowl of cereal. That was my go-to classic. You could also do a bowl of yogurt with some fruit on top or some granola. Those are all great dishes to try to begin this unpleasant work, I would say. Could be a potentially unpleasant work, right? So once you've weighed out your amount and it looks all good and scrumptious, dig in and wait for the results. Now, do me a favor. Report back here with your amount of lactose that you had before things started going left, right? My advice is that you should wait a few days or maybe even a week before you actually start, recording things. If you start high, like if you start with a whole 150 grams and you have symptoms, I will wait a couple days before you try like the lower amount, like half of that or even half of that, right? You don't want overlapping results is what I'm trying to get my point across. And if I completed this work before the time this video comes out, my amount of lactose should be on screen right now. And this is the exciting part of this video, the community, the people. It'd be great if we somehow were able to, take all the numbers that we report and make it a giant bell curve to see just where we all fall. Do you fall in the middle of the bell curve where you're like, 3 grams, that's all it takes. So in closing, obviously, calculating the amount of lactose in your favorite dairy products is extremely nerdy, but I think it's actually very valuable. Life is short. Who wants to completely cut out a whole entire food group due to an intolerance? It's not an allergy, right? It's not life-threatening. It's just an intolerance. You have, basically on your worst day, you ruin the Netflix and chill. It's okay. The whole point of this video is to demonstrate that you actually can eat things if you have an intolerance to them. It just depends on your portion and how much lactose it contains. And hopefully this video shed light on how you can figure that out on your own, which I think is powerful. All right, so with that being said, if you like the video, be sure to like it. And if you want to see more, subscribe. Well, shout out Moo. Next time you see him, we'll probably be at the Brazilian Steakhouse.